Thanks, Linda. Thank you, everybody. So guess who will not be watching the Super Bowl tonight? Because I'm not into it. I'm not into professional sports. When I was a kid, 12 years old, I was in the kitchen learning to bake with my mother. So I got harassed a lot. But you ought to try my baked goods now. Now, I say this, you know, Lincoln excites me, history excites me, the law excites me, mediating cases, which I do now that I'm failing in retirement, that excites me. Sports do not excite me, but good luck for the Patriots tonight. You can call in the score at my house. Virginia will give, and oh, by the way, I'm not denigrating professional sports. Except to bemoan the fact that real heroes, to me, are the veterans that serve in the military and do public service for nothing, very little, and take the abuse that we give them. And of course, historical characters, which you know are my real heroes. But having said all that, and what I've learned as a judge and I hope a citizen, it's this entertainment, this professional entertainment, really does affect millions of people. And you can't ignore that. If that's what engages tens of millions of our fellow Americans, so be it. And we've got to deal with that. And I'm not saying this damning with faint praise either. This is not a happy story here. I hope tonight is a happy story. Actually, we're still living the problems of Reconstruction in our Civil War, as I think all of you know. So for many Americans, Reconstruction is still remembered as a period of racial anarchy, political failure, and the humiliation of the defeated South. Indeed, it is probably fair to say that Americans' impressions of the era have been shaped, if only half-consciously, by films such as Birth of a Nation. Anyone remember this early? This was done in the teens, and a very racist movie, very pro-Confederate, pro-South, Ku Klux Klan, and of course more in our generation, Gone with the Wind. With their caricatures of predatory Yankee carpetbaggers and scalawags, more than by a detailed knowledge of what actually happened in the South between 1865 and 1876 and in the years that followed. It is sometimes inspiring, but more often deeply shocking story that reveals the nation at its best and worst, when newly freed slaves and idealists, both black and white, struggled to preserve the rights that Union armies had won on the battlefield and that Republican members of Congress affirmed in the years after the war. Now, I ask you to see Reconstruction not as bad policy, further doomed by corruption and incompetence, but as a profoundly forward-looking program that was subverted by organized violence and an inept administration. The central question about Reconstruction is usually why it failed, as opposed to ended, which hints that the process itself was somehow flawed and contributed to its own passing. The policies of Reconstruction were not only just, but also economically sound, and they brought desperately needed change to the South until they were violently overthrown by men who had fought for slavery during the Civil War and continued that battle in a new form of guerrilla warfare over the next decade and beyond. Reconstruction was driven by a genuine moral commitment, 750,000 lives, equivalent to 7.5 million today, North and South, to tear slavery from American soil by its roots, by stripping former Confederates of political power, while transforming former slaves into educated, landowning citizens. It also had a political dimension that was less idealistic. Republicans hoped to craft a majority for their party in the South by welding together coalitions of newly empowered blacks, Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist, and Unionist whites who some believed were only waiting for encouragement to join hands across the racial divide. The prospects for enlightened reform were promising in the months after the Confederate surrender in April 1865. Most Confederates understood that their power was shattered and were prepared to accept whatever terms the North offered. Biracial Reconstruction governments were often politically dynamic and no more corrupt than their all-white counterparts. They worked hard to pass legislation and provide services that decades of antebellum planter control had neglected. At the state level, laws expanding married women's property rights were enacted, divorce proceedings were modernized, minors were protected against parental abuse, and white fathers were made financially responsible for their mixed-race children. Black-dominated city councils paved dirt streets, established boards of health, and integrated police forces and public conveyances. Hundreds of blacks were elected to local, state, and national office, including the U.S. Senate and House. Aggressive federal land reform transformed lives. At the time of secession, 1860, almost no Southern blacks owned land. By 1880, 20% of black farmers did a remarkable advance in the face of unremitting white hostility. Dramatic achievements were also registered in education, thanks to hundreds of black and white teachers who volunteered to work in new schools sponsored by the Federal Freedmen's Bureau, serving primarily black children and adults. This effort marked a revolution in a region where the education of slaves had been illegal almost everywhere. Excuse this dialect, but this tells the story. The white folks didn't never help none of we black people to read and write no time, recalled one former slave. If they catch we black chillum with a book, they nearly about kill us. They didn't want them to learn about freedom or our history or the vision, for example, of the Declaration of Independence. The Freedmen's Bureau schools quickly achieved spectacular gains in literacy. Less than 2 months after the end of the war, Freedmen's schools were educating 2,000 children in Richmond, Virginia alone. By spring of 1866, a year after the war, at least 975 schools were educating more than 90,000 students in 15 southern states. By late 1869, more than 250,000 pupils were enrolled in freedmen's schools. Literacy was imperative for black economic security. Ex-slaves needed to read in order to understand deeds and labor contracts. In fact, this was one of Lincoln's plans, and there were many, they hadn't coalesced yet, during the war to help freedmen, women, children, to gain the rights of citizenship. You see, it's not just the freedom brought about by the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, final freedom, because there's a big disparity between just actual freedom and the rights of citizenship. The right to vote, the right to hold office, to sit on juries, to marry, to sign contracts. That was the big divide. And Lincoln's way out of that, which turns out to be true, I think, even looking backwards, is education. We needed that education. Although freedmen's schools were open to whites, few attended. Despite the absence of statewide systems in most southern states, most parents preferred to consign their children to illiteracy rather than to see them educated alongside black children. White families who did send their children to bureau schools were typically ostracized or physically beaten. In the post-war years, blacks in the North, inspired by the new civil rights legislation and the heroic examples set by black Union troops during the war, were 200,000 of them enlisted to fight for freedom and union, were more willing to confront authority and challenge the North's own ingrained racism. Remember, there were many Union soldiers who were very unhappy at Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, saying they didn't free to serve the N, to free the N using the N word. We fought for the Union only. Northern blacks, though not subject to the same violence as in the South, were sometimes denied equal schooling, segregated in public conveyances, and abused when they tried to vote. Although defenders of the Old South will doubtless disagree, there is a compelling case that American society as a whole would have benefited mightily had Reconstruction been permitted to fulfill its early promise. In particular, it would have saved the U.S. from the long Jim Crow agony of racial repression and the distortion of national politics by the South's determination to protect segregation at any price. So what went wrong? Reconstruction's problems began with what was arguably the worst decision that my hero, our hero, Abraham Lincoln made as president when he dropped from his 1864 re-election ticket his capable vice president, the abolitionist Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, and replaced him with Andrew Johnson, the Unionist Democrat from Tennessee. Now, there's still a question in historical circles as to what role Lincoln played in seeing that Andrew Johnson become his vice presidential candidate in 1864. We don't know for sure. It's not like today where the candidates choose their vice presidential nominee before the convention or at the convention. This was left more to the party pros. But knowing Lincoln, as I think I do, and his fine hand in all things politics, it would astound me if he did not know or have a hand in picking Johnson as his running mate. Lincoln hoped to shore up support among Northern Democrats and win the trust of voters in the reconquered areas of the seceded states. Lincoln's assassination a week after Appomattox put Reconstruction in the hands of a racist, formerly slave-owning, and an alcoholic who sabotaged efforts to extend civil rights and physical protection to newly freed slaves. Johnson encouraged Southern whites to reassert their power and ignored violence against freedmen and white Unionists who were trying to form biracial coalitions. By executive order, he returned hundreds of thousands of acres to white planters. Republican military officers were replaced with compliant Democrats, many of whom averted their gaze when armed white leagues drove teachers from their schools, assassinated local black leaders, and intimidated defenseless black and white Unionist voters. Blacks who dared to defend themselves were murdered wholesale. Lawlessness, not Reconstruction, became the order of the day. In Arkansas, one freedman reported in a letter to Pennsylvania Representative Thaddeus Stevens that the rebels had burned down a fine African church which cost the freedman about $5,000 and left 24 Negro men, women, and children hanging from trees around their cabins. In New Orleans, 34 blacks and 3 white allies were shot down under white flags. In Texas, at least 62 freedmen were murdered in December 1867 and January 1868. In the run-up to the 1868 presidential election, across the South, as many as 1,300 black voters may have been murdered to prevent them from voting. Johnson was impeached in 1867 and came within a hair's breadth, this is the committee of impeachment in the Congress, came within a hair's breadth of being removed from office. Ulysses S. Grant, of course, won the 1868 election, and for a few years, federal troops attempted to protect Republican voters in the South with the full support of the new president. And by the way, I've had the honor and the pleasure to read Ron Chernow, he of Hamilton and the musical Hamilton, and a great biography of Washington. He's got a new biography of Ulysses S. Grant that will be out this fall, and it's in a dazzling volume, with all of Grant's warts and strengths, including his alcoholism. He was a functioning alcoholic. That's Chernow's theory. I highly recommend it for you, those of you who can stand to read today 750 pages. Now, if you can't, you do what I do, even after I read the book, and that's to get it on audible.com and run it through, download it on your iPad and run it through your car radio, or get it in CD. It makes for great listening on the way in and out of Providence. But the violence didn't end, despite Grant's support of the citizens' rights due the black man. Vigilante outfits, the Ku Klux Klan was just one of many, had learned that they could get away with murder and continued to do their bloody work. While not usually coordinated from state to state, they followed similar patterns of ruthless vigilante warfare. Rarely did gangs of white redeemers, as they like to call themselves, bother to conceal their identity. In 1873, more than 100 black Republicans were massacred in Colfax, Louisiana, almost all of them unarmed, after they had surrendered to a force of white vigilantes. Similar slaughters took place across the former Confederate states. Only the numbers of the dead varied. One white participant in the Colfax massacre, quoted by Nicholas Lemon in Redemption, the Last Battle of the Civil War, which deals at length with this atrocity, blithely reported, "Luke lined 5 men up and his old gun went off, and he killed all 5 of them with 2 shots." As the years passed, Southern revisionists turned such massacres into glorious victories that they were not able to get at Appomattox, against armies of savage blacks that had never existed. Today in Edgefield, South Carolina, there is a shrine to the Red Shirt movement, whose bloody redemption of South Carolina from biracial democracy is dramatically rendered in Stephen Budiansky's The Bloody Shirt Terror after Appomattox. Red Shirt leader Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who boasted of his role in a notorious massacre in Hamburg, South Carolina, in which several disarmed black militiamen were murdered, was later elected to the U.S. Senate and became a role model for the young Strom Thurmond. Paradoxically, Andrew Johnson's incompetence helped to empower congressional radicals who in 1868 and 1870 pushed through passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments guaranteeing black citizenship and the right to vote. But Northern attention, never wholly committed to the cause of black rights, soon drifted elsewhere. Federal troops were needed on the western frontier, and the enforcement of civil rights flagged. And to Grant's dismay, as he started his second term, he noticed what we all know in our own culture. There's a weariness for conducting long wars. We want it over. We want to move on, which is a natural characteristics of people who live in a free society, as we do. But that worked against enfranchising the freed black. The close presidential election of 1876 was pivotal. With key votes in dispute, neither Samuel Tilden nor Rutherford B. Hayes had a clear majority in the Electoral College. white-dominated former Confederate states, in a notorious compromise, agreed to yield their votes to allow the election of Hayes, a Republican, in return for guarantees that federal troops be withdrawn from the South. Thereafter, the Democrat-controlled House agreed to approve military appropriations only if federal troops were never used again in the southern states. One might say that the violence that had crushed Reconstruction's highest aspirations now reaped its reward: Northern abdication and Jim Crow. One of the best books on the subject, The Wars of Reconstruction, by Douglas Egerton, won't entirely replace Eric Foner's magisterial and equally wide-angled Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, which devotes more attention to economic and labor matters and to the development of capitalism during the period. Ex-Confederates such as the politically courageous James Longstreet, Robert E. Lee's senior corps commander, who after the war became a Republican and embraced biracial reform, and Northern black crusaders such as Octavius Cato of Philadelphia, helped make the assertion of civil rights a national cause. Collectively, these men, Cato, Kane, and Downing, bring to life the war that was taking place not just in the halls of government, but also deep in the small towns, red dirt hamlets, and cotton fields where the bloodiest combat of Reconstruction took place. Now, Robert E. Lee, we know, is the hero who resists pressure from his lieutenants to keep the war going, says many, including Jay Winnick, who wrote a great book, April 1865. Winnick and others seem unaware of the powerful argument by George Frederickson that it was not a desire to save the Union, but rather to preserve Southern class structure that kept Lee from showing the war to become a conflict that white Southern elites could not control, that is, turning the Confederate Army into guerrillas and not have them really surrender after Appomattox. But they controlled it in other ways. The most basic reason for opposition to Reconstruction, however, was that most white Southerners could not accept the idea of former slaves voting, holding office, and enjoying equality before the law. They had always regarded blacks as an inferior race whose proper place was as dependent laborers. Actually, the difference between Southerners, many Southerners, whether they owned slaves or not, was this idea that slaves were not human beings. They were property. The value of each slave putting next to his name in the tax assessor's books. Reconstruction, they believed, had to be overthrown in order to restore white supremacy in Southern government and to ensure planters a disciplined, reliable labor force. One might even take the view of the historian Barbara Fields, who eloquently said in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, that's 50 years old now, on PBS, that if, as she believes, the Civil War was a struggle to make something higher and better out of the country, then the Civil War is not over. Has anything changed in 50 years? Almost 2 generations? Except the election of an African American? We're still a house divided, just as Lincoln said in 1858. A particularly glaring deficit in our memory that black office holders in the early Reconstruction era demeaned by many pro-Southern historians and portrayed as lascivious buffoons by fictionalizers such as Thomas Dixon Jr., whose novel became the basis for Birth of a Nation, were substantial citizens well prepared to govern, as beautifully told in John Hope Franklin's classic From Slavery to Freedom, A History of the American Negroes. In print, since first published by Knopf in 1947, with the 9th edition coming out in 1997, African Americans is now substituted in the title for Negroes. These Negroes, African Americans, blacks, had often risen from a middle class of ministers and businessmen that existed in antebellum America, beyond the view of racist whites. By the turn of the 20th century, however, once effective biracial coalitions across the South had been destroyed and black voters almost completely disenfranchised through physical intimidation and electoral trickery. White supremacists took control in the former Confederate states, and shamedly, I say, our Supreme Court didn't help either. For this time, we had a policy of separate but equal, as espoused in the 1895 decision Plessy versus Ferguson. This would not be changed, would it, for another 60 years with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and then the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Anyone who lived or worked in the Jim Crow South could see the price that African Americans paid for the crippling of Reconstruction. In the mid-1960s, it was always difficult to persuade would-be voters to appear before hostile white registrars, even more so after the Ku Klux Klan held a rally festooned with Confederate flags on the steps of the courthouse where the blacks were required to register. A century after the Civil War, blacks in the South could still feel so vulnerable that they would flee at the sight of a white stranger. Members of a nation who rightly regard themselves as residents of a more just and democratic society than many others on the planet are collectively loath to admit that good and honorable policies were consciously overturned by a reactionary minority, while thousands of people across the nation found it easier to look the other way. Perhaps Abraham Lincoln was naive about his hope to reconstruct the South. He had thought the Civil War would be a short one, and after that turned into a false hope. Most of the time, his time was spent on how to win a long one. The transition from a slave to a free society would take a social revolution. The Johnson administration, Andrew Johnson, seems to confirm the founders' wisdom about character and the danger of demagogues. Ulysses S. Grant's administration confirms Lincoln's remark that Americans are the almost chosen people. Grant was running a race against time, not only in regard to white Southerners who had been displaced from power, but also the flash flood of his cronies whom he had trusted. Yet Grant did yeoman service to Lincoln's dream in suggesting that justice in an open society would eventually become more likely in the long term. Thank you all very much. We have time for questions, Linda?
Yes, we do.
Do you have one, Linda?
We're still a nation divided.
Yes. Yes, sir. And I'll take you next. Yes, sir.
As we look back on history, there are certainly specific events that were turning points in our history. The American Revolution, Civil War, World War II. You consider our current situation in America a turning point in our history?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We're going to come out one thing or the other. In view, whatever you believe of the incumbent president, it is a revolution. Hopefully without any more violence than we already endure. That's domestic terrorism. And then, of course, we have the threat from overseas now here of the international terrorism. And how we come out of it is anyone's guess, other than, you know, our motto in Rhode Island, our state motto is hope. It's a great motto. And that and faith, yes? I think we can overcome it, but it's going to be painful. Like, we haven't had enough pain in raising families, in multi-wars and disputes and conflicts, even in our neighborhoods. We've got a ways to go. Yes.
What is this picture called?
Well, this is a print of, and it's in color, and it's Lincoln being received into heaven after his assassination by the angels. This was the artist's rendition. As you can see, his tombstone there, and then the angel bearing him into heaven after his death.
And there was also something on TV, I think my mother watched it about, apparently some people were stealing his body more than once.
Oh yeah, that happened. They tried to steal it, but they got caught. The security for the remains was not good. So this was at the end of the 19th century, and there was a conspiracy, but it was uncovered, and the Secret Service was able to stop the theft. They were rebuilding the tomb to house Lincoln's remains, and the remains, while it was being rebuilt, was put to the side, not really secured, to make it easy for grave robbers to get at it, but they were stopped.
And they had to coat it in cement.
Well, yeah, they encased it in cement way down. If you go to Springfield, I hope you do, the hometown, to see his tomb, where he and Mary are buried, and 3 of their 4 sons are there too. The 4th, Robert, who was Secretary of War, is entombed in Arlington National Cemetery. Someone else. Yes.
U.S. Grant was a great general, and a lot of people said it wasn't nice waving president, okay, but couldn't he have done something, when you served for 80 years, as far as war reconstruction?
Well, he did try.
He did.
You see, here's the paradox, the contradiction, and I tried to make this point early in my talk. The plan for Congress and even part of the presidency, whether it was Lincoln or Johnson, was very forward-looking. And for example, in 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights legislation, Civil Rights Act, which is still relevant today, to ensure full equality and rights enforceable in the courts for all citizens, for all races and creeds. And the fact that there was some who thwarted that purpose doesn't make the plan bad. It makes the avarice of individuals more pronounced. And this is what Grant confronted, because his Congress, for example, with a limited army, much reduced after the war, to just enough soldiers to cover the frontier issues with Native Americans, took away that lever that Grant had to enforce the civil rights legislation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, because you needed troops on the ground. When local officials who were former Confederate soldiers and unreconstructed Southerners refused to prosecute, including state's attorneys, what justice was there for the black man or for the whites who went down to assist or were there to assist? So there's only so much one person can do without a coalition. That's what Lincoln spent 4 years doing, was building a consensus among the North to continue on with the war after war weariness set in and the number of casualties kept rising. That's what a leader does, is to try to inspire. And Grant tried to. If you asked a black man then, an African American then, they recognized they recognized, I'm not sure about today because there are many who consider Lincoln a racist, but that they knew that Grant was a friend of the black man, but could only do so much, and that was the problem. Yes?
Do I take your answer to say that if Lincoln had lived, he still couldn't have pulled off this dream?
Nope. He could have done better, certainly, than Andrew Johnson, who was really inept and alienated himself from the people and also from the Congress. He needed the votes in the Congress. Lincoln would have gone further. How much further? We don't know.
But you're not too optimistic.
I'm not too optimistic. There still would have been that pushback, and I think we would have seen Jim Crow, if you want to call it, the use of black codes and disenfranchisement and segregation of public accommodations for many decades yet to come. Maybe not 100 years, but who cares? I mean, who's counting when the same evil banality is existing? Yes.
Judge, are there federal statutes prohibiting failure to prosecute?
Tough to say. Not really, because this. Well, because that's the difference between tyranny and discretion for a democratic office holder, small d. Because it's really the discretion of the prosecutor to prosecute. Now, if he fails or she fails, you don't get reelected, and you're also subject to the criticism of the public. The other problem is to over-prosecute or to be overly zealous in the prosecution of people that shouldn't be prosecuted. So it's a judgment call. Yes?
So if Lincoln had lived and had gone on, would we still see him in the same light today as we saw?
Oh, I think so. Would we see Lincoln in the same light we see? What's the light you see him in? Yeah. Full of character and empathy, humor, leader, gets up every day to make the donuts like you do. That tedium, that's what makes our life go, as tedious as it gets. Can you just see him walking around the executive mansion, as the White House was called then, in his slippers at 2 a.m, waiting for news from the battlefield and wondering what he has to do in this bushel of multitasking that he had? That's the kind of leader we need. And we've been short-circuited a leader like that for a long time. This is just my opinion now. And that's what judges give, we give opinions, right? No shortage of opinions. This is why I like to mediate cases, because I don't have to give a judgment. I can try to get the people themselves to get the case resolved with your help and the attorney's help. Yes?
Okay, so while you're being a judge, we got a guy who's trying to do something like this, and we got a judge who's getting in his way. Is that judge right or wrong?
Well, that's the system. That's why we have, and I'm not going to get into that, because I know how you voted, which is... We have 3 branches of government, remember? Judicial, legislative, and executive. And we're supposed to be independent. When I was your chief, every day, I had to spend part of the day on preventing the other 2 branches from subsuming the judicial branch. They weren't doing it mendaciously. It's just the natural way people are in the use of their prerogatives or what they perceive their prerogatives to be. But that's what your job is. So whether the judge is right or not, in your case that you're asking, we're going to see, because it's being appealed to the circuit court, and that's part of the judicial system, and probably the Supreme Court. I have a feeling, though, and I'm not being sarcastic when I say this, that we're going to see a lot of this incumbent's decisions winding up in the courts and appealed. So get used to it. Get used to the ride. Yes, Colonel.
I voted the other way. With the potential of a Secretary of Education who doesn't believe in public education, but...
Charter schools, that's what she's into, right?
Right. Do you see a potential for segregation coming back if there's a voucher system and people get to go where they want?
I don't think so. I think there's a potential and that there'll be a risk, but I think our education system, and I'm not an educator, you know, in the field, in the field, at least I recognize it, that I'm not. But I think our education system has been so skewed in the last several decades that it's hard to see where we're going to come out with any Secretary of Education, because we're just not getting to young people. And maybe we ought to take away the cell phones and the internet while they're in the classroom. But when you ask 11 and 12 and 13-year-old people if there are, how many branches of government there are, and most of them don't know, then I think we've got a real basic problem in understanding democracy. And don't let me get started with my national draft, which I think I've said to this audience before, and that is everybody serves their country and community between the ages of 18 and 20. I mean everybody, even those who are disabled. There's a place for them. And I don't mean just the military. I mean in all areas, the Peace Corps, the old Civilian Conservation Corps, the inner city, everything. Because that's the only way we're going to get back to this community spirit and give back to a democracy that we owe so much to. Unfortunately, I don't have the votes in Congress to do it, and they don't have the testicular fortitude to pass it. And also, unfortunately, again, it will be like a World War II, preemption World War II, that causes us to even consider a policy like that. So I don't mean to end on a unfortunate remark. So ask another question. Yes.
Lincoln's assassination by Booth, okay, he did say, let them down easily, the South had it. So it sounds like they'd have been much better off had he not been assassinated. Much better.
I think so. Actually, he said, let them up easy.
Right.
From defeat. And what he was saying is exactly what you were saying, that we should be conciliatory. And that's what his second inaugural address says, if you read the last paragraph. And they were all to blame, North as well as South, for this evil institution of slavery. You know, slave traders were from this state, right? And we're making money from bringing them in the triangle, picking them up from West Africa, and then bringing them to the South for good money. But here's the thing about Lincoln. We talk about what if, you know, if he lived, which we all hoped he had, is that he carried both the carrot and the stick. So, okay, we want to have you come in. We want the states to rejoin the Union. They never left, according to Lincoln. We want them to accept the 13th Amendment, the 14th on equal rights, equality, and due process, and the 15th Amendment, which is the right to vote, and the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1874. But if they didn't, he would have found a way, I think, even more than Grant, to keep soldiers in the South until there was adherence to the rule of law and the protection of all people. So he would have done that, and if it had risked his reputation, I don't think he would have cared that much about it.
I think that's what we needed, our leaders.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for joining us today, and
This is always a wonderful time for me. I always feel so much better. I'm glad you didn't end on that low note. Because
Me too.
it is a wonderful country, and patriotism is somehow gets distorted these days. And I just want to be able to be proud of my country. And I'm hoping that in the coming year, in spite of whatever's happening, we'll get there. Thank you for coming. Join us again. And thank you, Judge Williams.
Okay, thank you. Can I have my